So happy Sabbath, everyone. Have you ever, my pages want to fall off the, have you ever been sidetracked? You're doing something and all of a sudden you're gone off this direction. Yeah? Well, when I was, a number of years ago now, it's 9 years ago when I did this, I was studying a certain chapter in the Bible, and I was really kind of struggling and wondering about it, so I ordered up a book that I thought would talk about it, and the book did not talk about that particular chapter, and I was so annoyed, I almost sent the book back. But I decided to give it a try and read the first chapter. Well, that's where I got sidetracked. And this study today is that first chapter. But surprisingly enough, that first chapter took me back to the beginning of what I had originally been studying. So God has a way. And this is what I was going to say earlier, is for those of us who were in Sabbath school this morning, I was sitting there listening to what we were discussing, and I thought, God has a way of doing things, you know. This sermon came into my mind, and afterwards I thought, well, I could have done this and that and the other thing. I thought, no, I've learned already. I need to go with what God has first impressed me. And the lesson study and what we're going to talk about today are like this, and I'm sitting in Sabbath school, I'm thinking, wow, Lord, really? So we're going to be in the book of Exodus. So grab your Bibles. You're going to need your Bibles. I've decided to not put anything on the PowerPoint because that makes us lazy, quite frankly. We need to have our Bibles in our hand. So open your Bibles, and we're going to be in the book of Exodus. By the way, that book that I almost sent back was written by Derek Tidball, and it's entitled The Message of Holiness. And I will have some quotes from him and others in here. So the story starts in Exodus. If one were to have asked an Israelite groaning under the Egyptian taskmasters to describe Yahweh, they might have answered, our forefathers had a God by that name, but well, he's forsaken us. And indeed, they felt forsaken, oppressed by the Egyptian masters. They had, to a great extent, lost the knowledge of the character and majesty of God. And when Moses showed up claiming that the I am who I am, the Lord God of your fathers, had sent him, well, they didn't really believe him. And the Pharaoh was obviously not impressed either, and made their life, in fact, much worse. In Exodus 6:9, they reject God's promise because of anguish of spirit and cruel bondage. So not only did they suffer under Pharaoh, but they suffered under God as they experienced the first 3 plagues along with the rest of the Egyptians. And it's not until we come to chapter 8, verse 23, where God makes a difference between his people, my people and your people, and that they would be able to experience something positive from God. It is through the next 7 plagues when they start to learn about and start to trust God. They see his great judgments on the Egyptians and experience his protection from the plagues. And their first test of obedience comes with the instructions for Passover. In chapter 13:7, when Pharaoh lets them go, they start to learn to follow God. Chapter 13, verse 21. And the Lord went before them by day in a pillar of cloud to lead them along the way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light, that they might travel by day and by night. The pillar of cloud by day and the pillar of cloud by night did not depart from before the people. Along the way, they discover that Yahweh is also a God who can provide water, food, and victory in battle. So after about 2 months of plagues and 3 months of traveling, they come to God's planned safe place, the wilderness of Sinai. As they entered the wilderness, the pillar of a cloud arose and settled up on top of the mountain. Great and radical changes were to be wrought in them, for the degrading influence of servitude and a long continued association with idolatry had left their mark upon their hearts and character. Now, this description we find of them in Patriarchs and Prophets of the Israelites, as well, to say the least, it's rather dismal. Among things, they had little knowledge of God and little faith in Him. Their long bondage had made them easily terrified, disheartened, and depressed. They lacked discipline and self-control. Thus, they easily became violent and unreasonable. Their doubt-filled hearts caused them to continually murmur and complain. In fact, suspicion and distrust so filled their hearts that they boldly accused Moses to his face of trying to kill them for his own personal gain. You find that in Patriarchs and Prophets. They were unwilling to trust God any further than they could witness the continual evidence of His power. They saw and felt only their present inconveniences and trials. It is here, in the wilderness, that they start to learn about the real essence of who Yahweh is: holy. As of yet, they have no idea what holy means. They know about cruel taskmasters and how to complain and give up, but they have no understanding about holiness. They will stay here for almost a year, all of which is devoted to holiness. They will make a holy sanctuary with holy furniture, and in their last month get instructions for holy worship and holy living, as recorded in Leviticus. Well, the dust has hardly settled over the camp before they were to prepare for the giving of the 10 Commandments, which are an expression of God's holiness. Interestingly, once they are at Sinai, God's first order of business is holiness. And just as the Israelites camped for a while, I want to take camp in chapter 19. So this is where we're going to spend our time, chapter 19. And we're going to see what we can learn about holiness. Now, it's often chapter 20 that is referred to for the descriptions of holiness. But before they could receive the 10 Commandments, there were things about holiness they needed to learn. So open to Exodus 19. I'm going to read the whole chapter, and I'm going to insert a few statements, and then we'll look for what I call the foundations of holiness. Okay, verse 1. And thank you, Lucas, for reading. In the 3rd month after the children of Israel had gone out of the land of Egypt, on the same day, they came to the wilderness of Sinai, for they had departed from Rephidim, had come to the wilderness of Sinai, and camped in the wilderness. So Israel camped there before the mountain. And Moses went up to God, and the Lord called to him from the mountain, saying, "Thus you shall say to the house of Jacob, and tell the children of Israel." Now Moses knows that his first priority is to meet with God, so he climbs the mountain. Well, that's where the pillar of cloud is. But once there, he must wait for God to start the conversation. This is not a conversation between equals. This is a conversation between God and his servant. And God also is the one who decides the content of the conversation. He instructs, and Moses listens. Verse 4. You have seen what I did to the Egyptians and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you shall be a special treasure to me above all people, for all the earth is mine. And you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words which you shall speak to the children of Israel. So far, their deliverance has been unconditional. They were all delivered, no questions asked, and no demands made. Just follow along. But now, God seeks to transform them from slaves into a holy nation. So God sets the stage for his first official address to them as a nation. It will be in the renewal of his covenant with Israel. Adopting the covenant would tie them not only to God's protection, but his demands. It would depend on their readiness to listen and obey God. And so just as God commissioned Moses as the burning bush, he now sets to commission the whole nation. So we'll continue in verse 7. So Moses came and called for the elders of the people and laid before them all these words which the Lord commanded him. Then all the people answered together and said, "Well, all that the Lord has spoken we will do." So Moses brought back the words of the people to the Lord. You notice that this is the second time Moses is up the mountain. So far, the only other time God has spoken to them using the word holy was in regard to the Passover, when they were finally released. Well, surely this time when he's speaking to them of holy, it'll bring some kind of great benefit. And while there was no doubt that they had a noble desire on their part to respond to God's call for obedience, they entered into the covenant relationship with but little knowledge of themselves and with no appreciation of their inability to keep the divine precepts and thus fulfill their part of the agreement. Now note this wonderful promise that God gives to Moses in verse 9. And the Lord said to Moses, "Behold, I come to you in the thick cloud, that the people may hear when I speak with you and believe you forever." So Moses told the words of the people to the Lord. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Go to the people and consecrate them today and tomorrow, and let them wash their clothes. And let them be ready for the third day. For on the third day the Lord will come down upon Mount Sinai in the sight of all the people. And you shall set bounds for the people all around, saying, Take heed to yourselves that you do not go up to the mountain or touch its base. For whoever touches the mountain shall surely be put to death. Not a hand shall touch him, but he shall surely be stoned or shot with an arrow, whether man or beast, he shall not live. When the trumpets sound long, they shall come near the mountain." Now this severe punishment was specifically announced by God to impress upon the people in no uncertain terms what it meant to be in the presence of a holy God. We should not forget that it was only by sobering threats of punishment that the Israelites, prone at times to be presumptuous and to rebel against the divine will, this is how they could be taught reverence. So continuing in verse 14. So Moses went down the mountain to the people and sanctified the people, and they washed their clothes. And he said to the people, "Be ready for the third day, and do not come near your wives." This is the second trip down the mountain. Then it came to pass on the third day in the morning that there were thunderings and lightnings and a thick cloud on the mountain, and the sound of the trumpet was very loud, so that all the people who were in the camp trembled. And Moses brought the people out of the camp to meet with God, and they stood at the foot of the mountain. So where's Moses? Also at the foot of the mountain. Oh, I don't think human words could describe the awful and fearful, majestic scene on that mountain. For in verse 18 it says, "Now Mount Sinai was completely in smoke, because the Lord descended upon it in fire. Its smoke ascended like the smoke of a furnace, and the whole mountain quaked greatly." Okay, good. "And when the blast of the trumpet sounded long and became louder and louder, Moses spoke, and God answered him by voice." Here we see God fulfilling his promise to Moses a few verses back. Verse 20. "Then the Lord came down upon Mount Sinai on the top of the mountain, And the Lord called Moses to the top of the mountain, and Moses went up. It's as if God pushed the pause button on his speech for an extra warning. He knew that there were some who were not ready to meet him. And in his grace, he wanted to prevent any unnecessary deaths and trauma. So Moses makes the third trip up the mountain and down the mountain. Verse 21, and the Lord said to Moses, "Go down and warn the people, lest they break through to gaze at the Lord, and many of them perish. And let the priests who come near the Lord consecrate themselves, lest the Lord break out against them." But Moses said to the Lord, "The people cannot come up to Mount Sinai, for you warned us, saying, 'Set bounds around the mountain and consecrate it.'" Then the Lord said to him, "Away, get down, and then come up, and Aaron with you. But do not let the priests and the people break through to come up to the Lord, lest he break out against them." So Moses went down to the people and spoke to them. So he's again at the bottom of the mountain. Now I do have handouts. Now I understand that not everybody likes handouts, and that's perfectly fine. But if you like a handout, it's fill in the blank. Bruno, can you? Okay, if you like a handout, please raise your hand. And oh, I need my water. I forgot my water. Philemon, I think Bata wanted one. Did you want one? Okay. Okay, thank you. Anyone really want one that does not have one yet? There's a couple left. Oh, you want one? Okay. So, foundation points of holiness. What points can we find? Remember that this is when God starts to teach them about holiness. There are other foundation points that will obviously come later. But here's where they start, the ABCs of holiness. So we're going to start in verse 10. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Go to the people and consecrate them today and tomorrow, and let them wash their clothes." Now, consecration is not necessary unless God is holy. God is holy. Every aspect of God's character stems from his holiness. Every action God does also stems from his holiness. This is so basic we take it for granted. And it's also so profound that we cannot really understand it this side of eternity. Verse 5. Now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you will be a special treasure to me above all people, for all the earth is mine. And you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. So here we learn that God is the only source of holiness. God is the only source of holiness. Their obedience will not make them holy. Only God can make them into a holy nation. And later, God explicitly proclaims his holiness, and that it is he who imparts or gives us holiness. We read that in a couple places in Leviticus. So the next, we're going to go to verse 12. Go to verse 12. You shall set bounds for the people all around, saying, take heed to yourselves that you do not go up the mountain or touch its base. Whoever touches the mountain shall surely be put to death. The people needed to set up boundaries to mark the dividing line between God's space and theirs. Therefore, we learn that God's holiness spreads to the space he occupies. God's holiness spreads to the space he occupies. This is an important point, for it will affect how they are to live. Let's see. For now, God is at a safe distance up on the top of the mountain. But by the end of Exodus, God moves into his newly finished sanctuary. It's just not the space inside the sanctuary and the courtyard that become holy. It is the whole camp. Thus, they will require special purity rituals given in Leviticus to help keep them safe while they are living in holy space. Verse 24. Then the Lord said to him, "Away, get down and then come up, you and Aaron with you. But do not let the priests and the people break through to come up to the Lord, lest he break out against them." So we learn that, surprisingly enough, maybe, God's holiness is lethal to sinful humans. God's holiness is lethal to sinful humans. Lethal, that which causes death. God's holy space is also lethal. Any living thing entering his presence is to be killed. For to invade his space or pry into his person is an affront to his majesty. Verse 5. Now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you shall be a special treasure to me above all people, for all the earth is mine. So we learn that God is creator and therefore owner of all. God is creator and owner of all. Now, this might not seem like a foundational point on holiness, but his creator ownership is a part of the holiness of God. It is just as much an essence of his person than any other trait. And this point is so important that this is the only point that God himself puts into words. He wants us to remember this. Verse 9. And the Lord said to Moses, "Behold, I come to you in the thick cloud." Now, God's hiding himself in a cloud is a mercy that protects people and preserves their lives. So we see that mercy is an aspect of holiness. Mercy is an aspect of holiness. If God were not holy, he could not be gracious, for he can only undeservingly forgive if there is a real offense to forgive in the first place. When God speaks to men, he must always veil his glory, for sinful men cannot bear it. Here at Sinai, since many of the people were ungodly and impenitent, it was the more necessary that he should cover himself. Verse 18. Now Mount Sinai was completely in smoke because the Lord had descended upon it in fire. The fire was not just for show. Fire is linked to God's holiness, where we see it for the very first time in Genesis 3, where the flaming sword was guarding. It represents a burning purity that consumes all that is unholy and unworthy. The fire reveals that there is a profound moral aspect to his majesty. So we learn that holiness exposes sin. Holiness exposes sin. Okay. So this is holiness from God's side. I'm just going to quickly recap on your handout. We've learned that God is holy, God is the only source of holiness, and his holiness spreads to the space he occupies. God's holiness is also lethal to sinful humans. God is our creator and owner. And God, part of his holiness is that God's mercy is his mercy, and his holiness also exposes sin in our lives. Okay, so what about our part? Do we have a part? As already noted, holiness comes from God. It means it goes to something or someone, and that puts us in the realm of the possible. After all, God instructed his people to be holy, for I am holy. So God's holiness demands a response, for his holiness comes to us on condition with specific requirements. Verse 4. Oh, you have seen what I did to the Egyptians and how God bore you on eagle wings and brought you to myself. What is he saying here? I want you to remember. So our requirement is the ability to remember God working in our own history. And why is remembrance so important? Because we so easily forget. All along the way, the Israelites kept forgetting. They forgot their bitter service in Egypt. They forgot the goodness and power of God displayed in their behalf in their deliverance from bondage. They forgot how their children had been spared when the destroying angel slew all the firstborn of Egypt. They forgot the grand exhibition of divine power at the Red Sea. They forgot that while they had crossed safely in the path that had been opened for them, the armies of their enemies attempting to follow them had been overwhelmed by the waters of the sea. And what was the result of their forgetting? Well, the list of their sins is a little too long to start talking about. I've recently been studying the book of Hosea, and I came across this quote in one of the commentaries on Hosea. As those people were also very good at forgetting, just like we are. It says, when God's grace is ignored or forgotten, people soon lose any sense of connection with the past or responsibility to carry on the values of past generations. When people forget their history or take for granted all the wonderful things they have, get this, they lose an essential ingredient of their identity and become something different from the ideals of their founders. And today in lesson study, someone who's quick in their Bible, 2 Peter 1:9. I wrote this down out of our lesson study. Who's quick with their Bible? 2 Peter 1:9. Okay, read real loud.
But he that lacketh these things is blind, and cannot see afar off, and hath forgotten that he hath purged from old sins.
What happens when we forget God's goodness? What does it say in that verse? We become blind. Not only do we lose our identity, but we become blind. Forgetting is dangerous. That's why our first requirement in holiness is to remember. Remember God's goodness to us. Okay, let's go to verse 4. You have seen what I did to the Egyptians and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Here we see God's heart. So the requirement is to be in relationship with God. That's what God desires, a relationship, to be in relationship. God did not bring that vast, ignorant, and untrained multitude out of Egypt to give them land. He brought them out to be his people. The object of his grace was so that they might enter into a relationship Verse 5. Now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you shall be a special treasure to me above all people, for all the earth is mine. Note the if-then connection. We talked about that in Sabbath school this morning. The if-then. Our if is what decides. So the requirement is to be obedient and to keep covenant or remain faithful to the covenant is the obedient, to be obedient. Now, rather than command the Hebrews to keep his covenant, which was his sovereign right, God graciously invited his people to do that which would be for their own benefit. The only avenue upon which we can walk with God is that of obedience. On no other terms but obedience could God consent to be their God or to have them for his chosen people. Go to verse 8. Verse 8. Then all the people answered together and said, well, all that the Lord has spoken we will do. So Moses brought back the words of the people to the Lord. So our requirement is to accept God's covenant term, to accept God's covenant terms. That God should take the initiative in proposing a covenant was inevitable, for man is not in a position to exact terms from heaven. Yet the covenant is an expression not only of God's sovereignty, but of his grace and mercy as well. Verse 13. Halfway through the verse it says, when the trumpet sounds long, they shall come to the mountain. Now jump down to verse 17. And Moses brought the people out of the camp to meet with God, and they stood at the foot of the mountain. So our requirement is to wait for and to listen to God's instructions. We need to wait and listen. There is a direct connection between the Word of God and the holiness of his people. Now, this requires learning to listen with the heart. Verse 18. Now Mount Sinai was completely in smoke, because the Lord descended upon it in fire. Its smoke ascended like the smoke of a furnace, and the whole mountain quaked greatly. Now, I don't know what you would have felt if you were standing at the bottom of the mountain, but there's something that we need. And we need to have an attitude of reverence. We need an attitude of reverence and awe. If the Israelites were to be the people of God, it was imperative that they appreciate the sacredness of their relationship with him. And there can be no true religious feeling without a profound sense of reverence. To inculcate such an attitude among the Israelites, it was imperative to impress upon them these lessons in a dramatic and striking fashion. God was trying to inject reverence into their irreverent hearts. Everything was done to impress the Israelites with the awful majesty of God and the spirit of solemnity that should fill one's heart upon approaching the divine presence. Verse 21. And the Lord said to Moses, go down and warn the people lest they break through to gaze at the Lord, and many of them perish. So notice what it was that God forbade them from doing. Breaking through to gaze. Enough was provided to waken their conscience, but they were not allowed to indulge their vain curiosity. And it is arrogant on our part to think that one can encroach upon God's forbidden holy space and survive, because sin and holiness cannot occupy the same space. So our requirement is the opposite. We need to have an attitude of humility. An attitude of humility. Before we can be recreated in His image, we must encounter Him on His own terms and humble ourselves before His awesome otherness. True holiness and humility are inseparable. The nearer the soul comes to God, the more completely it is humbled and subdued. So let's just do a quick review. The first point that we need to do is to remember. It's so important to remember God's goodness in our life. God seeks to have a relationship with Him. And our part is to be obedient, to learn to accept, to wait and listen, and to have those all-important attitudes of reverence and humility. So what does the Israelites learning about God's holiness have anything to do with you and me? Well, are we any different? Do we really know about holiness? Could you give me a definition for holiness before this? I don't suppose I could have either before I did this study. And even now, I'm going to let others talk. Now, knowing about God's holiness and knowing what is required is not enough. It has to make a difference personally. But how? The following short quote from Tidball puts many of Mrs. White's concepts into a unified statement. And this is in your handout. This is at the bottom of your handout. The essence of holiness is to be found in imitating the character of God. All else flows from this. It means living in His image and overcoming the ways in which His image in us is corrupted by sin. It means combating all that would prevent us from living in His image. It means cultivating all that would reproduce His image in us. It means becoming increasingly God-centered, Christ-like, and Spirit-empowered. The essence of holiness lies in restoring God's image in us. The holiness of God provokes awe and humility, evoking obedience and righteousness. It inspires purity and compassion in equal measure. God's holiness creates a sense of unworthiness and an intense longing for the Spirit to transform us. It calls forth effort on our part while casting us wholly on the work of God within us. And from the Desire of Ages, we read that holiness is wholeness for God. It is the entire surrender of heart and life to the indwelling of the principles of heaven. So when we look at the Israelites, we are astounded at their disregard for all things holy. Well, equally astounding is our own disregard and how much we are like them. They were unwilling to be transformed. But will we choose a different response? God is still eager today to have a transformed people, and He's still calling out what He called out in verse 5. He's still saying, "Now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you shall be a special treasure to me above all people of the earth, for all the earth is mine." I want to be willing. I want to learn to stand at the foot of the mountain, to listen attentively and humbly to the voice of God, calling me to be one of His special people, transformed and transforming for the sake of his world. So how about you? How about us? Are we willing to take the time to be holy? 500. As we sing this song, stand with me and sing this song as a commitment to the Lord, as a promise to the Lord, that we are choosing to make that choice to be holy with him. Time to be holy.